Welcome back to Math 103. This is video number 5 on growth and finance. By what overall percentage will the tuition have increased after 3 years of 4% annual increases? After 3 years, the original tuition will have been multiplied by this growth factor 1.04 a total of 3 times. There are 3 separate multiplications by the factor 1.04. So that's the same thing as taking the original tuition and multiplying it by 1.04 to the third power. In other words, we can take all 3 of these 1.04s, multiply them together first, and then multiply by the original tuition. That's the meaning of this 1.04 to the third power. If you go and ask your calculator how much is 1.04 to the third power, it will tell you 1.1249. Now, 1.1249 has to be converted to 1 plus something. Okay, this is the 3-year growth factor right here. It is 1 plus something, and the plus something tells you the percentage increase. Right? So the increase part is the 0.1249. That's 12.49%. Right? The overall 3-year increase is by 12.49%. Notice that we did not need to work with the original tuition. We only needed to work with the growth factor. If you liked thinking about 3 years of growth, you're going to love thinking about 18. So the same question can be asked, by what overall percentage will the tuition have increased after 18 years? The same thought process will convince us that 18 years of 4% growth are represented by 18 separate multiplications by 1.04. Thus, whatever the original tuition is, it is the same thing at the end of the day, whether we take the original and multiply 18 separate times by the 1-year growth factor, or we take that original tuition and multiply once by the 18-year growth factor. Right? So this 1.04 multiplied together 18 times, so 18 copies of 1.04 multiplied together, that's what we mean by 1.04 to the 18th power. That is, all in one number, the 18-year growth factor. This is the first time we're seeing a growth factor greater than 2, and that's significant. Right? The original tuition, whatever it is being multiplied by a number slightly greater than 2, which means that original tuition, whatever it is doubling, slightly more than doubling. It's being multiplied by slightly more than 2 over the course of 18 years of growth. What does that tell us about percentage growth? Well, we still have to go through the same thought process that this growth factor equals 1 plus something. When you multiply by this growth factor, you're getting 1 copy of the original tuition plus the new growth part. And that new growth part happens for the first time to be something greater than 1. And when you translate this number into percent form, you do it in the usual way. You multiply this number by 100. You move the decimal point 2 positions to the right. Thus, the percentage increase is something greater than 100%. That's okay. Right? The percentage increase is 102.58%. When a quantity increases by exactly 100%, that would mean that it was exactly doubling. It was exactly being multiplied by 2. Here, our quantity is increasing by a little bit more than a factor of 2. The growth is by a little bit more than 100%. How does this work for 30 years of growth? Well, it's the same thought process. After 30 years, the original tuition will have been multiplied by the 1-year growth factor 30 separate times. And that's equivalent to being multiplied by one number that's computed as 1.04 to the 30th. And that one number, that 30-year growth factor, happens to equal 3.2434. Right? We're going to typically keep 4 decimal places of accuracy when we write out these growth factors. Since this growth factor, the 30-year growth factor, has to equal 1 plus something, that plus something, corresponding to the new growth, equals 2.2434. In other words, the tuition will have increased by about 224.34%. So whatever this quantity is after the 1 plus, that corresponds to the new growth. That is what you convert into percent form. Now consider what would happen if tuition decreased by 4% every year. We could study the effect of successive 4% decreases in the same way that we studied successive 4% increases. We've already seen that a single 4% decrease is represented by a 0.96 decline factor. So whatever the original tuition is, to decrease by 4% means to be multiplied by 1 minus 0.04. In other words, to be multiplied by 0.96. Okay? And we reasoned that out as whatever the original tuition is, 96% of it remains after a 4% quantity has been taken away. Now our question is, if a 4% decrease occurs every year, by what overall percentage will the tuition have decreased after 10 years in a row of 4% annual decreases? So every year, tuition undergoes a 4% decrease, and that happens 10 separate times in a row. That's equivalent to taking our original tuition and multiplying by a single number, 0.96 raised to the 10th power, and that happens to equal 0.6648. Think of it this way. After 1 year, only 96% of the original tuition remains. After 2 years, 96% of 96% of the original tuition remains. After 10 years, 96% of 96% of 96%, etc. There are 10 separate mentions of 96%. Whatever that is, percent of the original tuition remains. Well, that's 66.48% of the original tuition. And we can only find out that 96% of 96% of 96%, etc. is the same thing as 66.48% by multiplying together these 10 copies of 0.96. So for the same reason why we multiplied together factors of 1.04, we now multiply together factors of 0.96. Now to complete our solution, here's a subtle point. This 0.6648, this 66.48%, that is not the answer to the original question. The original question is, by what overall percentage will the tuition have decreased? This is asking what percentage of the original tuition disappears. This 66.48% is what's left. All right, so 66.48% of the original tuition remains. 100% minus that, in other words, 33.52% of the original tuition, that's what will have disappeared. So this 33.52% here, that is the answer to the question as given. If you think that's a little bit tricky, you are not the first one to have that thought. Another way to phrase this is to say that 0.6648 is our growth factor, really a decline factor. Like any such factor, it's really 1 plus something, where the 1 represents one copy of the original, and the plus something represents the change. Now if you go ahead and solve for what that something is here, by subtracting 1 from both sides of this equation, it turns out that that something, that change, equals negative 0.3352. And the fact that it's negative indicates that the change is a decline. That's another way to see that the drop is by 33.52%. In order to practice this important idea, before going on to the next video, answer the following question. If tuition, currently $10,954, declines by 2.5% every year for the next 15 years, then by what overall percentage will the tuition have decreased in that time, and what will the new tuition be after 15 years?